Hey everybody, this is Mr. Stam. This is gonna be a test. See if we can actually go through some of this stuff. It's late. I'm tired. We're recording. We're gonna see what's gonna go on here. We're gonna do our normal marine biology stuff. We're gonna talk about our animal of the day very briefly, and then we're going to try to do a couple notes on the starfish. Should take less than 10 minutes. Let's see how this works. So, first of all, let's start with our marine animal of the day. Here it is, the wonderful American lobster, Homerus americanus. Sometimes this is called the Maine lobster. If you've ever eaten lobster, this is probably the lobster that you've eaten. Um, it's a pretty big lobster. They can be up to 45 pounds sometimes, and probably the largest crustacean in the world. Um, as you can see, it has a really thick shell. That's the exoskeleton that all crustaceans are going to have. Um, that exoskeleton is actually not going to grow with the animal. So these are large crustaceans. They're going to molt. Molting means basically shedding their skin. So they're going to lose that skin. They're going to grow it back. It's going to come back a little bit bigger every single time. I always kind of liken it to if you're like a knight with a suit of armor. If you start growing, you got to get a bigger suit of armor. These guys do the same thing. Well, their exoskeleton is going to grow. It's made of a substance called chitin, which is a combination of carbohydrate and protein. Pretty common in the natural world, but it's going to make most of your exoskeletons of your crustaceans, of your insects, and things like that. So, very thick shelled. The biggest feature, obviously, are going to be those huge claws in the front. Always is going to have two different size claws, the bigger ones for crushing, the smaller ones for more chopping up stuff. So any prey that it has, any other smaller organisms that it's going to try to eat, it's going to chop it up here, here with these the big claws, and then bring it up to its mouth right here, where it's going to go right into the mouth. And notice it has two large and two smaller antennae. That's very common for crustaceans. Pretty big body here. The abdomen is right back here with the tail. That's going to be segmented, many different segments. Imagine a crayfish, but like 5 times bigger. For the most part, they're this color. There have been descriptions of them being blue or even a bright green. You can even see some coloration here in the bottom. Sometimes they're split right down the middle. One side's blue, one side's green. So some pretty cool coloration for sure. They are eaten by some larger fish, especially as juveniles. When they're smaller, they can be eaten by more fish. And they're pretty much normal crustaceans when it comes to reproduction. They're going to do internal fertilization. So the male is going to release the sperm. Female is going to, receive that sperm. Eggs are going to develop. Those eggs are actually hatched. And along the backside of this tail part is where they usually kind of protect their eggs until they hatch into small little baby crustaceans, basically little American lobsters. And those lobsters will grow into these huge 45-pound lobsters that you're familiar with. They're fairly common. They're not really threatened. The fisheries up in the northeast of America is very well regulated, very well managed. It's basically based on size and technique you use to catch them. And it's been very successful in keeping their numbers fairly high and also sustaining a very rich fishery. So a very successful story when it comes to managing wildlife. So that's the American lobster. I'm going to have you guys, instead of taking attendance for this test, I know it's a Friday, I'm actually thinking you probably doing this, but on a discussion unified classroom, I want you to put, instead of saying that you're present, I want you to write a post saying one thing you learned about the American lobster, a question you have about the American lobster, or anything you want to talk about the American lobster. So that's sort of what the plan is, I think, for the animal of the day. Make sure you post in the discussion. You'll see it on Unified Classroom for today's class. Just make a post like that, and that's how I'll know you are present today. So that's the first thing. Second thing I want to talk about real quick, and this is going to be very few notes. I want to kind of move forward, see how this works. This is definitely a test. Is a little bit more about our friends, the starfish. Starfish, obviously, are echinoderms in general. I want to talk about two aspects of their life history. And that first thing is their nervous system. They actually do have a nervous system. when we hopefully dissect. Hopefully we will. If we don't, I'll show you some dissection video, and hopefully, if we ever see each other again, we can do this live and in person. But their nervous system, you'll see it. It's fairly complex, even though they don't really have a brain or any central nervous system. They do have some things that are absolutely communicating throughout their body. They have basically what's called a nerve ring, and I'll show you a picture of this in a second. It's around that central disc. So remember, these are pentaradial. They have 5 legs around a central disc, and the nerve ring kind of goes around that central disc, and then the what we would call the radial nerves are going to go down each arm. So each of the 5 arms, and that's sort of how they communicate to other cells, cell communication, and just general communication. The nervous system is going to do. They do have some senses for observing their natural habitat. Each one of them has basically an eye spot, we call it. It's not a true eye like you're thinking, like the squid and octopus had, where they're actually seeing images. It's more of a light sensitive eye spot on the tip of every arm. So every arm is going to have a tip that has a light sensing organ. And that organ can kind of tell them if it's light, dark, give them some sense of where they're at, daytime, nighttime, that kind of thing. So shadows coming by, if someone's trying to eat you, it's going to know what's going on. This is a picture of it. So if you look at this, we have this little spot right there, that little red thing there is the eye spot. The eye spot is very small, but it's going to be able to detect light, which is all it's really trying to do. Now, this is that ring, nerve ring right there. That's where the main nerves are, and then they go down each arm, and those are your radial nerves. So radial just being down the radius of the organism. So that's pretty much how their nervous system works. Very simple, not like anything we've seen yet before. It's definitely not as complex as the squid and octopus, but it's definitely something to look to. And finally, today, just with our notes a little bit, let's talk about the reproduction, because you can't talk about biology without talking about reproduction. They are absolutely dioecious. They have a male and a female. So there's a male one and there's a female one. Parts basically. And there's external fertilization. All sperm and egg meet basically outside of the body. They do have that deuterostome development, so we're going to see this in a picture in the next slide. But they're going to have during development. We talked about this earlier. This is why they're really closely related to us as eukaryotes, as vertebrates, or not eukaryotes. I'm sorry, as vertebrates. They have deuterostome development versus what we would call protostome development. The protostomes, the ones earlier than the starfish and the echinoderms, when they are forming, when the blastula forms and then caves in, the actual mouth is going to form first. As we said, for deuterostomes, it's a little bit different. The very first thing that forms when it folds in is actually the anus, the other side of the digestive system. And that's very similar to what us as chordates, as vertebrates, are going to do. So that's a unique part of their development, is the deuterostome part, for being a very simple invertebrate, seemingly simple. They can regenerate their lost body parts. We've already talked about that. If greater than 1/5 of their central disc remains, it can grow back into another whole starfish. So it doesn't need much material, but it can grow back into another whole starfish. Here's the life cycle. We're going to start right here. I'm hoping you're seeing that red pointer thing. This is the male. This is the female. They're dioecious, so there's 2 different sexes basically. The sperm is going to come out of basically the top part here, and it's going to, then the eggs are being released separately by the female, and there's fertilization is going to happen outside the body. Now, in the ocean then, so in the water, it's going to have, your first fertilized cell here. It's going to form a blastula, which is a ball of cells basically early on, and that's going to basically form this hollow ball that's going to eventually cave in like this. So these cells here, really early cells, cave in, and this is that deuterostome development, basically meaning that that's going to form the anus, and it's eventually going to cave in all the way right here. So one side's going to be the mouth, and one side's going to be the anus, and that tube is your gut, basically, your digestive system. But the anus forms here first. That's why we call it deuterostome, at least in this case. That simple cellular organization is going to eventually form very small planktonic free swimming larvae. Nothing like it, does not look anything like a starfish. It's going to be floating in the water, swimming pretty freely, and then eventually it's going to form. And you see the top of it here will actually form. It looks like a crown here, but if you would look down on it, it would look like a starfish a little bit more. And that's going to basically develop and form, and eventually you'll see a central disc. The central disc is this crown thing here. This is the top view over here. And this is a side view over here. But then eventually off that central disc, you're going to have all the 5 legs forming and eventually forming into an adult. So that's kind of a life cycle of a starfish. Here's a picture, a little bit of a video of some floating larvae. The larvae are bilaterally symmetrical. If you look at it, if you come right down the middle there, it's a half. One half looks like the other half, like a mirror image, and it really is different than the pentaradialness we see in an adult. This is a cool picture. Those small little things swirling around this larvae are algae, and it usually makes this like whirling motion that basically allows to eat up a lot of algae as food. So it's pretty cool. Now, obviously, we've done a couple things here. Hopefully, you've watched us a little bit. Definitely a test to see if this is going to work. I have no idea how this is going to work, but we're going to find out together, I guess. Make sure you comment on the Unified Classroom on our page. You'll see the discussion. Post something about the American lobster that you learned, that you're curious about. If you have a question about it, any kind of post works for me. It doesn't have to be long. Just post something about the American lobster that you learned about. And then we'll get back to the starfish. I'm not going to have an assignment linked right now. We're just kind of test how this all works. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it works. See ya.